Good morning. This is ERG strategy and I'm trying something different. I don't know how this is going to work. Is the camera going to be too shaky? It's taken me a while to record this particular video. Obviously, I said we're recording a series of 3 videos about navigating some tricky political discussions. This final one around the UK Supreme Court ruling has taken me forever because it's such a tricky topic, hence why we're doing this video, right? So for, a couple of weeks, I've been like, how do I want to position this? What do I want to say? I've been looking at the additional guidance and notes that have come out and kind of taking a view based on that. So I may not even release this, right? But as I was walking this morning, I started to get some real clarity over how I wanted to frame this. I think it's helped because in the last week or so, I've spoken to a few of the LGBTQ plus ERG leaders in my network. We're going to be having a session here in the UK with some expert legal advice as well, which is great. And I think that's basically helped to sort of like solidify what I'm thinking. So here goes. I want to start with, so obviously this is the ERG strategy, right? The channel that tries to help me with all of this practical, tricky stuff that we're going through at the moment, right? So I want to start with the resources that I'm going to recommend, depending on what your perspective is. I always go to what one of my friends said, and she said, we should always look for evidence that disproves what we believe, right? It helps to counter confirmation bias because, as we all know, confirmation bias is when we only look for evidence that supports what we think, and we tend to discount evidence that doesn't support what we think, right? So the first thing to do is always just look for evidence that counters what you think. That will absolutely help you understand the other perspective, right? The other side. And so I'm going to start there actually in terms of resources. So apologies for the light. It's not a bright day today. So in terms of resources, I'm going to start with the book, first of all, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's a book that I've mentioned before. It's called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It's not only about politics and religion. It's actually about things like different beliefs, value sets, why people, kind of disagree about really tricky topics, and sometimes why they can't even explain rationally why they believe what they believe. I say we, right? Because this is how we as humans act. So that's my first recommendation. And all of these recommendations you can get on audiobook. So you can listen to them while you're walking or working out or whatever, right? So The Righteous Mind is the first one that I'm going to recommend. And then the second book I'm going to recommend, particularly if you lean more gender critical in your thinking, the other book that I'm going to recommend then is, and I'm not going to go as far as Who's Afraid of Gender by Judith Butler. I mean, obviously you can read that if you want to, or obviously there are other books around, beyond the binary. But the one book I'm going to recommend actually, which is going to sound a little bit random, but I'm going to recommend The Patriarchs by Angela Saini, because I think what's really interesting about that book is it doesn't really go into, is gender binary or not. It's not really about that. It's about how gendered norms came into different societies, right, throughout the time. So it's kind of like a bit more anthropological. So that's the book that I would recommend if you lean more gender critical, because I think it's a great book anyway, just about women's rights and equality and all of that kind of thing. So that's the one book I'd recommend. If you are more of the mindset around, sort of like trans issues, etc., then I'd recommend you to read, of course, Catherine Stock's book, right? You may be like, right? But there's a really great saying, which has become my favourite quote recently, which is by John Stuart Mill. And the quote is, "He who knows only his position knows little of that," right? So what that basically means is, if you only understand your own position, do you really understand it, right? That's the theory. If you want something that's a little bit more scientific, because I must admit, when it comes to non-fiction, I have read Kathleen Stock's book, but when it comes to non-fiction, I prefer things that are quite science-based, which is why I love the Patriarchs, because the author, Angela Saini, is a scientist. So another book I'd recommend is maybe Tea by, I'm going to say Carol Hoover. I want to say it's more sciencey. She has her critics, right, as do, all of these books. But that's one I'd recommend to you. Okay, so I've talked about the resources. Now, so in terms of conversations, a bit like the previous videos, I always think it's useful, especially if you're an ERG leader, to understand the different aspects of the argument. Why do people have different views? Because I think that then helps you navigate the conversation. So that's my first thing, which is why I've recommended the resources. But the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, especially for those in the UK, is I think it's useful. There are some useful learnings from history. And when I say history, I'm talking about Section 28, which was the legislation that came in the UK to stop promoting, in quote unquote, education about sexual orientation away from, hetero relationships, basically. So I think it was, I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like, it's banning the promotion of homosexuality, in particular in schools. Perhaps not too dissimilar to what's happening in some of the states in the US. But in the, oh gosh, I'm forgetting my years. I'm going to say was it 78 that Section 28 came in? I can't remember the exact year. I'll have to put the links below. But basically, I think when you look back at that situation, there are potentially some learnings in terms of public attitudes, how it came about in terms of the law, etc., how politicians voted for it, how it was used. But interestingly, I think also the learnings then in terms of how it was eventually repealed, right? And how did the public opinion move, and why did it move? Why did things go back to actually granting rights and, bringing in, for example, same-sex marriage, right? So I think there are potentially learnings there. If you're not aware of that particular ruling and what happened and how it was repealed, etc., do look into that. A really interesting person to whose work you should probably consume if you haven't already is Patriarchs. Obviously, he was very instrumental in gay rights at the time and overturning that legislation. So those are some of the lessons from history. And the one thing I would say, I think, particularly if you are in the trans and non-binary community and feeling, kind of like under attack, politicians have a great way of targeting certain groups at times when it suits their purpose, right? We see that. The only thing I will say is obviously in terms of with Section 28, that was overturned, okay? So I think there is just an element of all is not lost, right? Let's get into the practicalities in terms of what you can do. So I think part of why I've been able to sort of crystallize my thinking is because I've gone a little bit more into solution mode. I think for many of us doing the kind of work that I'm doing, or if you're working with ERGs or you're an ERG leader, I think there was a lot of wringing of hands and maybe almost like disbelief in what had happened and the pronouncement that came out from the UK Supreme Court. And the reality is as well, it was a finding of principle rather than here is the practical application. And even now, with the additional guidance that's been given, people are still incredibly confused, which tells you a lot. It's almost as though the law was being used to, almost like to try to settle an argument, but it wasn't really thinking practically what that would mean. Obviously, there has since been a consultation, but I think there is still some clarity. There are still some legal challenges that are ongoing. There's some quite senior barristers that are challenging it. There's some senior barristers that are calling out and saying it's not really fit for purpose. And even obviously the body that's issued the notes has recommended that if organisations are unclear, that they should get legal advice, right? So that kind of tells you everything in terms of the clarity of what's been given. But I've kind of flipped into solution mode. I'm like, let's not wait for this particular body in the UK to, kind of come up with something that is useful or practical. How can organisations get on the front foot? And that's literally what I said to an LGBTQ plus leader in a conversation last week over coffee. I said, how do we help organisations get on the front foot? And in particular, how do we arm ERG leaders with what they need? So for me, what that looks like is, what are the solutions? We need to start working on what could the solutions be. And the other thing that I'm recommending, so if you are an LGBTQ plus ERG lead, I'm going to suggest that as a minimum, you work on this with your women's network. Most organisations, if there is an LGBTQ plus network, there will be a women's network, right? So this is where I'm really asking for the women's networks to show some serious allyship in terms of really being that support for our LGBTQ plus ERGs in terms of emotional support, moral support, but also working on solutions. And this is where I actually feel that together, the women's ERGs and the LGBTQ plus ERGs should be coming together to work on the solutions. When we work on solutions, it brings people together, right? When we work on solutions and when we work on tasks and solving the problem together, solving these issues together, it can bring people together, even if they have very different perspectives. That's one thing I wish I'd said in the previous two videos, right, about these tricky issues. But some of those issues didn't necessarily have practical implications, right, for the work day, but obviously this one does. So my suggestion is basically those two networks in particular, and any others that want to get involved, maybe the parents and carers networks as well, because that's obviously more closely connected to things like family structure, etc. All of the networks that should come together, but in particular the women's network and the LGBTQ plus networks should be coming together to look at solutions in terms of, obviously, if you're an organisation that only has spaces that are not used by the public, there are different kind of guidelines and issues to consider than if you are an organisation that has spaces that are open to the public, right? You know this. So that is basically my advice on the back of this. I genuinely think that the best way to move forward and to find some common ground on this particular issue is for those two networks in particular to lead the charge in terms of working with HR, DEI, legal, PR and comms to work through some practical solutions. Obviously, you have those teams, and if you need additional legal support, etc., that should be organised, obviously, through the organisation. You shouldn't be carrying this burden on your own, particularly if you are an LGBTQ plus lead. But that would be my recommendation, that the women's networks, I really want women's networks to step up at this point and potentially be that bridge, actually, between these two, what appear to be diametrically opposed views. I think the women's networks really have an interesting role to play in bringing the two groups together and potentially helping to facilitate some great practical solutions. And there are practical solutions. Maybe I'll do another video at some point around things like facilitating sessions where you get practical solutions, right? But anybody that's worked with me, particularly if you've been to any of my face-to-face workshops, you will know that I love a silent brainstorm, right? Give people time to think and kind of like, you know, be really creative. Or, you know, 6 thinking hats, or there's all kinds of ways to get as much creativity, unconstrained thinking as possible, because genuinely that is what I think we need to actually come up with solutions that work. And different organisations are different, the needs are different. But yeah, that's basically my advice on this one. Let's kind of stop arguing about the principles. Let's get into solution mode. Let's come up with some solutions that work for everybody in the organisation, that don't discriminate either group, that respect people's views, but are practical solutions that work. And let's get creative, because I know a lot of solutions have been kind of mooted and thrown out randomly, but I've only heard like 1 or 2 solutions, right? There's way more potentially that are out there. So that's my recommendation. Let's get creative, right? I talked about the resources. If you're here in the UK and you want to reach out to me, please do drop me a DM or go and find me on LinkedIn. I don't often talk about this topic on LinkedIn because this is a topic that needs so much nuance and context. I just tend to think it's actually quite difficult to have sensible conversations through a LinkedIn post and in the comments. So I tend not to talk so much about it, but there is a lot going on in the background. And if you want to plug into some of the ways that we're supporting LGBTQ plus leads, particularly here in the UK, then reach out to me. We're not doing so much for LGBTQ plus leads in other countries or the US, so maybe that's something we need to address. So if that's you, if you're in another country and you're going through similar but different challenges that you want me to look into, drop me a note. I hope this has been useful. Sorry for the quality, but this is my thinking process, and it kind of just came to me as I was walking this morning, that I now have a little bit more clarity over what I wanted to say, and I really hope that was useful. And yeah, really here for you. You know, we are here for you as an organisation at what for some is an incredibly difficult time. All right, that's it. We out of here. More videos soon. Take care.